Welcome to the Design Thinker podcast, where we explore the theory and practice of design. Hosted by me, Dani, and
me, Peter.
So what are we talking about today, Pete?
Today, Dani, we are talking about curious experimentation.
Curious experimentation.
I like the way you said that with a tone of curiosity.
So what does that mean to you, curious experimentation?
What does it mean to me? To me, an experiment experimentation is the act of experimenting, and experimenting is doing experiments. So an experiment is a structured way of learning by trying something out. I'll go with that. And then curious experimentation, I like the addition of curious because, for me, it puts the emphasis on finding something out, perhaps more than proving or disproving something. I'll go with that. I just made that up off the top of my head. I quite like it.
I like it too.
What about you? Curious experimentation.
So curious experimentation is actually a term that I labeled that came out of my research. I don't know if you know that. And the reason that I labeled, so when I was doing my research, there was a bucket of things that were aligning as a theme. And I was playing around with what do we call this? And what was sitting in that bucket are things like, being open and courageous enough to try different things, to test things out. At the same time, recognizing that actually when you test something out, it may work out, it may not. And how am I going to recover if it doesn't work out? Right. So it's that. So the curiosity comes from really being curious, like, what if I do this? What might happen? And then also at the same time, being okay with it might not work out, but I'm going to still focus on what I can learn from it.
There's a couple of questions springing up for me when you're describing that. One of them is, why curious and not courageous?
I think having been trained both from a design perspective and from a research perspective, I think the starting point of both is curiosity. And I think being curious has curiosity has an element of courage built into it, right? I have to have a little bit of courage to go, you know what, I don't really know about this, but I'm gonna be open and try to figure it out. Like that takes courage, right?
As you were saying, that made me think of, as a kid, sometimes you might come across an old garden shed with an old chest of drawers in it, and you're interested in what's in. You're curious, I guess, about what's in the drawer, but also maybe slightly worried about, is there going to be spiders or other creepy crawlies inside, or what you're going to find out. And I suppose that having the curiosity leads you to need to find the courage to open it. And I think what you're saying and what that is an example of is in our brains where the sort of risk and reward thing, isn't it? We're curious enough that our courage is called up, and the courage outweighs the fear of the consequence. Something you said really got my interest as well, about asking yourself the question, how am I going to recover if it goes wrong? We're probably jumping ahead in our nice framework we've got for our conversation, but is that even having that question right at the beginning before you've started experimenting, is that a key ingredient to being able to curiously experiment?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The reason that we aren't curious and we don't experiment is because we haven't given ourselves permission to fail.
Okay.
And sometimes that permission is permission we give ourselves. Sometimes that permission is, in our work environments. Maybe you work in an organization that hasn't given some people permission, like, hey, it's okay if you fail. So I think it's kind of like, until you have that safety net of I'm going to be brave and I'm going to go be curious and I'm going to try this thing. And if it doesn't go well, I know that there'll be something there to catch me. And I think a lot of times the reason we don't experiment and aren't curious is because that's missing.
Either it doesn't exist, like the permission to fail doesn't exist, or we're not aware of that that permission to fail. That kind of metaphorical or maybe literal safety net. Should we look up the definitions of curious and experimentation?
We can do that. We can have a bit of a Googling moment.
Let's do that.
Why don't you look up curious and I'll look up experimentation.
Okay. I've got curious. Do you want to know
Yep.
this? So
Yep.
Curious is an adjective, eager to know or learn something, or it can also mean strange and unusual. Middle English, which and then from Old French curios, and that comes from the Latin. Originally comes from the Latin curiosus, which means careful, and it's from cura, to care.
Which is interesting, right? Because curious and caring in modern English feels like they might not fit together.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. What about experimentation or experiment?
So there's the traditional, when we think about experimentation, one definition is the process of performing a scientific procedure, especially in laboratory, to determine something.
Mm-hmm.
Another definition is the action or process of trying out new ideas, methods, and activities. That definition aligns with what emerged in my research as how people in organizations experiment when they're trying to solve problems.
Trying stuff out. And not necessarily having a rigorous scientific framework around that, trying stuff out.
To have some method, right? Like it can't be randomly trying things out. There's got to be some thought that's put into it, some sort of methodological way of experimenting. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the dark, right?
Yeah.
Something has to inform what you're experimenting with.
Yeah. So it has to be informed, and it has to have, I'll paraphrase what you said slightly, it has to have an intention. Maybe we could even say it's, a question that it's seeking to answer, maybe. And then a method or an approach that's defined.
So I know we like to usually give examples that help ground this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to tell you a story.
Cool.
And have a little bit of a chat about it.
Yeah. Hold on. I'm just going to sit back in my comfy chair with my cup of tea and a biscuit to hear your story.
It's story time with Dani.
Okay. All right.
This was a couple of years ago. It was around, 8:00 in the morning. And I knew I was going to have one of those days where it's just going to be meeting. Mm-hmm. And so I go into the kitchen to grind my coffee beans, to get my coffee going, and my coffee grinder dies. Okay. I've got about 15 minutes before my marathon of meetings start, which isn't quite enough time for me to run to the coffee shop and back. Mm-hmm. So I am in a bit of a panic because coffee in the morning is very important to me. And now I'm dreading this idea of, oh my God, what am I going to do? Mm-hmm. So I've got my beans, I've got my hot water, and all I need is these beans to be crushed up into some way. Okay. So I start going through the kitchen cabinets, like what can I find that can do this for me? Mm-hmm. So one thought I had was, I found a rolling pin, and I thought, what if I put these in a Ziploc bag and try to bash them?
Okay.
And I tried that. And it kind of worked. It cracked some of the beans, but I quickly realized I'm probably going to destroy my countertop, or bench top, as you would say, as we say in New Zealand, before I got to coffee. So I stopped doing that. And then I thought, I wonder if I've cracked these beans enough to actually make coffee, and then quickly figured out, no, that's not that.
Mm-hmm.
So I went about, trying different things. And then I saw my blender, which I use to make smoothies and crush fruit and things like that. And I thought, oh, if it can crush ice, perhaps it can crush coffee beans.
Yeah.
So I chuck my coffee beans in there and hit the little button, and voila. Not as fine of a grind as you would get with a proper coffee grinder, but enough of a grind that I could make myself a proper cup of coffee. I used that and made my coffee and then sat down for a day of meetings. How is that an example of curious experimentation?
Good, nice story. I like your story. That's a big problem, not to have coffee in the morning, especially if you've got a day of meetings ahead of you. You had a problem to solve. I'm looking through the checklist that we put together so far. Maybe there's some stuff we can add to it by exploring the story. So you had a problem to solve. So you had an intention, which was to find out how to grind coffee beans without a grinder. Well, I'd say your method or approach is finding. Well, I guess you're looking around the kitchen for things to grind the beans with. It sounded like you were, in terms of curiosity, you were, looking for, seeking, had your eyes open to, and had your mind, I guess, open to things that could be used for grinding coffee, which weren't necessarily intended or designed for grinding coffee. So, for me, that sort of, I guess, lateral thinking, as far as experiment goes, where you've tried a couple of different things until you find one that worked. I think for me, it's ticking all the boxes other than this one of giving yourself permission to fail, because as a fellow coffee drinker, imagine if you hadn't found, maybe it was more a desperate experimentation than curious experimentation. there was a real impetus and drive to grind the coffee beans. I'm curious now. Did you have anything in mind that you try next if the blender hadn't worked? What did you have your eye on? Or where was your mind going to?
So some of the things that I was thinking in the back of my head was like, oh, what if could I boil the beans, the coffee beans, right? Like, would that strain out enough of the coffee, or roasting them? So I had all these things going on in the back of my head. And then I also had this thing like, well, I've only got 15 minutes. And then as a backup, I thought, well, if I can't figure out coffee, then maybe I could just make myself a cup of tea, which, I do drink tea, but it's not my preferred beverage in the morning. So, my brain was kind of going at a lot of things. And what I like about that story is, and the reason that I tell that story is I think sometimes we think about something like curious experimentation and we think, oh, it's got to be this big thing and it's going to take a lot of resources and it's going to, and, we have these ideas about what curious experimentation is. And we also think that it's only appropriate for, big things or, super important things. And yes, like, morning coffee to me is super important, but it wasn't a problem that was going to bring the world to a screeching stop, right?
Yeah. You would have been maybe less effective and slightly more grumpy, perhaps, if you had to go into that all those meetings without your coffee, but you would still have survived and performed more than adequately, I'm sure.
Thanks for that confidence, Pete. But the reason I like that story and I share that example is, is to demonstrate that curious experimentation, it's very practical and it can exist in our day-to-day life. Yeah,
I think it's a great example of that. And a couple of things also about it are, well, I can imagine being in the kitchen doing the same thing. And I think of that as kind of playing around. And maybe this is an alternative definition to curious experimentation. It's playing around with a time limit, because you had time as a constraint, which is definitely a feature in the real world of any experiment as well. It needs to have some sort of end date. Otherwise, I don't know, is it an experiment if it has no end date? And then finally, I love the fact that your mind was thinking, well, if I can't grind these coffee beans, what's an alternative solution? And that it helped you kind of reframe the problem from coffee to caffeine. And again, that's a great, I guess, next step or part of experimentation. It's not being fixated on a particular solution or maybe even question. It's as much of a mindset as an actual, as much as an approach. And for the listeners, the way that Dani looked at me there when she went, was very kind and forgiving. What she was really saying with look was, yeah, it is, you dummy, it is a mindset. Curious experimentation, it's a mindset. Well done, slow hand clap. Well, welcome. Great story. Why, other than getting your caffeine fix before meetings, why is having a curious experimentation mindset important for us as designers and design thinkers?
Everything comes back to this idea of like, we have to get better at being better problem solvers, right? Like more and more we're facing problems for which, like, there's very few problems that we face today where there is one solution to the problem and it's sitting boxed up on a shelf somewhere. And the kinds of problems we're facing today, we have to be willing to try different things. And sometimes the solution comes in the form of multiple solutions to solve one problem. But we cannot get there until we're willing to experiment, right? I think for a long time we've existed on when a problem pops up, we kind of look backwards or we look at, around us and go, okay, what options have we tried before? Let's kind of pick the best one and move forward. And we're in an environment where that's just not cutting it. We have to be willing to experiment. Now, that doesn't mean that something already exists that might work, but it might be that something exists that could work, but it exists in a context that we've never applied it before, right? So I never used my blender to grind coffee beans. I only thought of that blender as making the thing I used to make smoothies. And now, and in that moment, I saw a different purpose for it. And I think that happens in our world today. Things can exist. But until we're willing to put on that mindset of being curious and being willing to experiment, we won't discover that.
So it's definitely about enabling ourselves and the people we're working with to open our minds so we can discover different solutions. Do you think curious experimentation can help us discover which questions are the most important? Like if we really early in the design process, we should be focusing on generating questions. But do you think curious experimentation early on can help us explore those questions?
Again, I think this is a yes and no because it's context specific, right? I think sometimes if a problem is happening in an environment where we do have a lot of things that we could work with, yes. But if that problem exists, like if it's an emerging problem, I think, again, if it's an emerging problem, curious experimentation might help us define the problem. So I think it's one of those things, like you and I have talked in the past about how the design thinking process, while we teach it and learn it in a very linear process, we know that it doesn't exist linearly, right? Sometimes you might be walking into a problem where you have actually built a lot of empathy for the people that are experiencing the problem. So you might not necessarily start there. You might actually start with curious experimentation because those people have generated ideas for you. And now you're like, okay, let's go test some things out.
Yeah, let's go and build some prototypes of things and, use those to experiment with, to use those prototypes to learn what works and what doesn't. Yeah, and we talked about experimenting or prototyping and testing a bit more in season 1, especially when it involves people and the ethics of that. For me, curious experimentation as a mindset, it embodies I think any kind of design, it needs to be iterative. A mindset of curious experimentation by definition means that you are going to be iterating, because you're going to be trying stuff out and learning from it, You're going to be continuously doing that. And if we, maybe haven't done this for a couple of episodes, but if we do the opposite, what's the opposite of curious experimentation? Well, it's ignorant, the opposite of curious, perhaps, or an opposite of curious, and then the opposite of experimenting is I don't know, is it implementation?
The word that comes to mind for me is stagnation, and it's probably not the right word. But the reason that comes to mind is I think one of the challenges that we have with solving the big problems of our times is that we're looking for this like perfect, ideal solution, right? And one doesn't exist. Like, I'll give you an example. Right now, one of the biggest things that organizations are struggling with is around the labor market is quite tight at the moment. So recruitment and retention are big top of mind things for organizations, and there isn't a magic bullet solution for it. The decision for somebody to leave their organization there's a multitude of factors that influence that, which means that the solution is also going to have to be multifaceted. And so I see very few organizations that are actually going, okay, here are the 4 or 5 things that we're going to try to solve this problem. They're all looking for this magic bullet. And while they're looking for the magic bullet, they're not actually doing anything that's contributing to solving the problem. So while everybody's off looking for the magic bullet, the problem's getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
I love that. That's a great example, and brings to life so much of this. I like that. Multifaceted problems require multifaceted solutions, and also, there is no one big solution to a big problem. Maybe go back to your coffee story. The equivalent of that would be going out and buying a new coffee blender. I don't think that quite works.
Well, no, it does, right? Because the ultimate solution was to go out and buy a new coffee grinder, but I couldn't do that in 15 minutes.
In the time available.
So in the time available, the best I could do was use my blender to grind the coffee, which was good enough until a better solution became available. Right? And I think it's the same. So if you take that and you extrapolate that to the recruitment retention problem, until we find this magic bullet, what are the things that we can do today that's good enough to help minimize the problem? And then if we're like, okay, this is the one thing we're going to do today to help minimize the problem, and then maybe next week it's actually, here are 2 things we can do to help minimize the problem, and then in a month's time, maybe we realized if you actually take all of these 5 things now together, it's actually helping.
Nice. So curious experimentation is within that mindset is a willingness, and almost maybe more than a willingness. It's seeking out what might be the series of small answers to the one big question you're exploring.
And that goes back to, what you were talking about, iteration, right? That it's not that we're being curious and experimenting once, but it's this idea that we're constantly looking at how can we make it better? How can we make it better? How can we make it better? And that's where that stagnation comment came from, or that word came to mind, because if we're not constantly looking at how do we get better? How do we improve? How do we move this forward? Then you are getting stagnant.
Or not just getting stagnant indicates that there's been some sort of motion. In some cases, just being stagnant, you've never been anything other than stagnant. Ignorant stagnation. Okay, so that I quite like that opposite phrase. So rather, how if we're finding ourselves either individually or in teams or organizations, kind of starting to find ourselves in a little bit of maybe ignorant stagnation, what are some ways we can help ourselves get out of that and get into a mindset of curious experimentation?
First, it's giving ourselves permission to go,
Yes.
hey, let's experiment here. And let's be okay if our experiments don't turn out to be the greatest invention since sliced bread. And I think the second step is to really assess the risk level, right? Like, I think we tend to look at risk or failure as like a one size fits all. Right? So like my coffee experiment, that coffee grinding experiment, that was a pretty low risk. Like, we weren't going to be out tons of money. Nobody was going to die. That was a pretty safe experiment to run. If you think about the retention recruitment problem, what are the problem's already bad. The biggest risk you have there is that you're losing people and you can't recruit, right? So anything that you experiment with that isn't contributing to making that worse should be relatively safe, because you're either going to help even a little bit make it better, or it's just going to remain as it is. And either way, you're at least knowing, well, that's probably not going to work. So you're still ahead of the game. So I think the second one is like doing a reality check on what the actual risk to this experiment is, and not just assuming any experimenting is going to be risky.
We talked about risk before, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again, but that kind of that risk of doing nothing in the recruitment situation. That doing nothing is not going to solve the problem. So therefore, logic suggests you need to do something. So the experimentation is about finding out, or the experiment, thinking about risk in terms of the experiment that, just not make the situation worse. Because like doing nothing is not going to fix it. So the experiment, that the only concern is, will the experiment work, make the situation worse? And if it won't, or we're confident it won't, then it's a good experiment to do. Okay.
So one is, the first thing is we give ourselves permission to experiment.
Yeah.
The second is sizing up the risk of experimenting and being very realistic about it. And then I think the third one is just getting on with it.
Yeah. Just hold on, let me just get on with it. Okay, got it.
And I know that sounds really like duh, but you'd be surprised, how many times in organizations this happens, right? You go through some amazing ideation work, you go through some really great, okay, what do we think we can try? And there's all this voting and discussion, and you land on a few things to go try. And then that just sits on a whiteboard somewhere and it never gets actioned. And I'm sure, Pete, in your experience, you've seen that happen plenty of times. I've certainly seen it happen plenty.
And I think that's why, what you said really earlier on resonates so strongly, is, the giving yourself permission to fail, but more specifically, it's that conversation. Maybe it's not just the thought, it's a conversation in an organization about how am I going to recover if it goes wrong. And the pre-mortem is getting together with the project group going, right, so if this goes completely wrong, what's the worst things that are going to happen? I'm starting to alleviate your individual and group fear about doing it in the first place, because you've already examined and explored and maybe mitigated the worst case scenarios. And that's, your how am I going to recover, or how might we recover if this goes completely wrong? Well, that's kind of exactly what that phrase encapsulates, doesn't it? But I mean, maybe what the reason it's grabbing my attention so much is that it's very rarely part of the conversation around taking those prototype ideas off the whiteboard and into reality. Often it's okay, just let's get going, and maybe if we're leading this kind of work, we'll just a pause and a pre-mortem type situation or workshop or conversation would be really helpful.
And I think also framing it as starting small, right? Like we tend to make things bigger than they need to be. And sometimes just starting really small helps build the momentum to do bigger things. So rather than waiting to build up the courage to do this big thing, what's the smallest step that we could start with? What's the tiniest experiment we can do?
Yeah, nice, because that creates the proof point, and that's not the proof point of, in terms of the end result of the experiments, the proof point about an experiment not causing the sky to fall or an organization to disintegrate from within. Yeah, nice.
And then I think we also need to do better at reframing when something fails, what does that really mean? So if we come back to my coffee example, the first thing I tried was a rolling pin and banging it, right? And I learned very quickly, hey, this might work, but I'm probably going to break the countertop before I get coffee. And I could have looked at that as a failure. I had an idea, I tried it, it failed. But in the moment, to me, it was like, this is the thing that's not going to work. So let me shove it to the side and go look for the thing that might work. And if you take that again and you extrapolate that and you apply it to the recruitment retention problem, you could try something and then go, actually, this is not having any impact on our retention recruitment metrics. Let me park that to the side and go see what else might work.
Yeah.
Right. And it's that ability to recover and see that failure as it was an idea. I tried it. Didn't work. Yeah,
nice. Maybe we could bring in here kind of degrees of so-called failure. What you noticed or perceived that perhaps if you continued along that line of experimentation, you would have done damage to or ruined your kitchen. We call it a worktop in Britain. They call it benchtop in New Zealand, and a countertop in the States.
Yep.
Well, isn't language great? Anyway, the hard surface that you were bashing. So, your Italian marble kitchen worktop, Dani.
Not that fancy.
Yeah, you stopped before you damaged that. So I suppose there's an element of when you're experimenting, pay attention. Don't walk away from your experiment because you need to, in your pre-mortem, I guess, think about what are the things that could go wrong and what signs might we get if things are starting to go wrong, and then what's our plan for stopping this experiment before it goes. And I was going to use the word catastrophically wrong, because there are still lessons to be learned from catastrophic failure. This is going to take a slightly dark turn, everyone, but let's say aviation accidents. That the reason aviation is so safe now is because there's been so many accidents before, and every single accident, there's lessons to be learned from it. Some of them have an extremely heavy cost and a tragic cost, but there's still lessons that come along with every failure. Coming back to your less tragic and consequential coffee problem, you stopped before you catastrophically destroyed your kitchen worktop. If, let's say, do a thought experiment on the recruitment, maybe we work with somebody and they design a new recruitment campaign, and there's an unintentional, let's say, it's unintentionally non-inclusive or exclusive, so that it's unintentionally excluding a group of people from, applying for these jobs, being interested in these jobs. What we're trying to say with that, that could be a catastrophic failure. So I guess, pay attention to what you're experimenting on and how your experiment is actually happening in the real world as it's going on. Don't just send it out there and then sit back and wait for results.
It's almost like knowing when to, stop the experiment, if you will.
Yeah. And, I guess to your point, starting off small and then scaling up is a really good approach, because you can pay more attention to the things that are working and not working within that experiment and adjusting as you go, rather than starting off with a huge, big experiment.
So let's see, we talked about what curious experimentation is, why it's important, how we might go about starting on the journey to curious experimentation.
Yeah.
So what does it all mean?
What does it all mean? Well, a mindset of curious experimentation is an essential ingredient of designing and being a design thinker. It's the way that we get ideas out into the real world and learn whether they solve the problem we've identified or not.
I like that. I don't think there's anything I can add to that, Peter.
Oh, wow. Okay. Goodness. We might need to like a special sound effect to play over the top of this, or it's like an audible gold star for me. What? Okay. I'm moving on before you change your mind. What's one or two takeaways for you from this conversation about curious experimentation?
I think one of the things I want to take away from this conversation is, really thinking about how do we enable it more at scale? Because I think, there's been several points in this conversation where either you or I have said it seems obvious, right? But the problem is that getting curious experimentation to happen at scale, as simple as it sounds, is really hard.
Okay. And to clarify, because people will hear the word at scale and kind of have a different mental model of it, but what you're saying is, how do we get a large number of small experiments to happen? Not how do we get one experiment to happen at a large scale? That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. So to rephrase or paraphrase, how do we get more and more and more people willing to do experiments?
Nice. That sounds like it's a good experiment. That's rife for experimentation. That question. I like it as a takeaway, though. I'm going to go away with that. I'm also going to go away with this building in the conversation about what we'll do to recover if it goes wrong. I'll say, if I hesitated there, is because I was going to say when it goes wrong. No, what are we going to do? What we're going to do to recover if it all goes wrong, or if it goes wrong. That's I really like that. And again, treating it as an experiment. I'm going to try that out when I get to experimenting in my next design project, and have that as a conversation, and then pay attention to the impact that conversation has on people's even demeanor or language or willingness to go, let's go and do this, let's give it a try, which is often quite challenging to get people to make things happen.
And I think when you're doing that, I guess an experiment within experiment is when you have that conversation around how are we going to recover if this all goes wrong, pay attention to, does that actually enable people? Like, does it make people more willing to experiment?
We'll report back in season 3. Cool. Well, I enjoyed our conversation about curious experimentation, Dani. We went lots of different places there. And finishing off on the coffee grinder, did you buy a different kind of coffee grinder?
No, I replaced I bought the same coffee grinder because, I'm one of those people, when I find something that works. And to be fair to the coffee grinder, I've had that one that broke for over a decade. So it was probably time for a new one.
Yeah.
So now we have, and I've learned from the past, so now we have about 3 different ways to grind coffee.
Okay. You've got a backup for the backup. Triple redundancy.
Just for the important things.
Yeah, well, airliners, most airliners now have like quintuple redundancy to keep them in the air. Feels like, there we go. That feels like a couple of good places to wrap up. Great
chat today, Pete. I think that does it for us for this episode.
Yeah. Thanks, Dani. See you next time.
Thanks, Pete. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.